Yesterday was General Election Day in the UK after Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister as was, called an election 6 weeks ago. Last night was an absolute nail-biter as Labour swept into power. In fact, it wasn't that exciting since Labour's win had been a foregone conclusion for months at this point. Of the 650 seats in Parliament, Labour took 412, leaving the Conservatives with only 121 seats, which is the fewest number of seats they've held in history. However, underneath the surface, this victory, or majority, is not as straightforward as it seems. While the Labour Party has a huge majority in Parliament, they only received about 34% of the popular vote. To put that in perspective, Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader who was wiped out in the 2019 election by Boris Johnson, received 40% of the popular votes. Because of the electoral system, those votes did not turn into seats in Parliament. Worse still, Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, has one of the lowest approval ratings of any Prime Minister entering office in history. It seems like the public are more against the Conservatives than they are pro-Labour. And while the headline story of the night was a Labour landslide, another landmark moment was the election of Nigel Farage to Parliament. Nigel Farage was one of the original architects of the Brexit campaign to leave the EU. His party, called Reform UK, won 5 seats. While at first this may seem minor, he actually received more votes than the Liberal Democrats, who won 71 seats in Parliament. Once again, because of the electoral system, this did not translate into seats in Parliament for Reform UK. But they have demonstrated a huge national momentum that consolidates the Brexit vote in the UK. Reform UK and the Conservative Party together got 38% of the vote share, showing that the right is still a major force in the UK despite the electoral wipeout. Why is this important? It shows that 4 years after Brexit, even though the economy is far from perfect and the cost of living is high, there are still vast swathes of the British public who remain determined in their resolve to leave the European Union. So divisive was the issue of Brexit that Labour, who are full of Remainers, chose to keep the prospect of closer ties with Europe out of their manifesto. Keir Starmer, a Remainer himself, has been silent on the issue, since expressing pro-European opinions would likely have cost him votes to Nigel Farage and Reform UK. Even the Lib Dems, who have fiercely campaigned for a second referendum, set EU membership as a goal for the longer term in their manifesto, and chose to kick the can down the road rather than making it an issue of the campaign this time round. Even though it seems that the British people are tired of the Conservatives, Brexit is nonetheless here to stay. For example, the BBC had an article called, quote, "Why are so few politicians talking about Brexit?" In the article, they say the following, quote, "Both the Conservative and Labour parties have judged it to be against their interests to go strong on the issue. They believe people have made up their minds about it. Brexit dredges up divisions within their parties and alienates some voters, whatever the candidates say. Labour has chosen to avoid a fight with the Tories about Brexit. It's done, says the party, and it's pragmatic to accept that. Labour is against rejoining the European Union, the single market, or the customs union." End quote. Even when the UK has made a huge swing to the left, Brexit remains a constant factor, regardless of whether the Conservatives or Labour are in power. It seems that Nigel Farage's party, although on the right of British politics, also took votes from many Labour candidates, meaning that Keir Starmer is unlikely to suddenly become more radical on his pro-European views even after the election, with the unpleasant prospect of Nigel Farage snapping at his heels. It looks like Britain is consolidating its position outside of Catholic Europe as the Tarshish power of the latter days. Contrary to the UK's swing to the left, the story of the French elections is a swing to the right. France elects a president on a national level as the head of state for a 5-year term, directly by the citizens. The French Parliament has 2 chambers. The National Assembly has members elected for a 5-year term, whereas the Senate has members elected for a 6-year term. Emmanuel Macron, who will be the president until 2027, called snap parliamentary elections. The first round of voting was held a few weeks ago, and the second round will be held this Sunday. The outcome of the vote, following the second round on July the 7th and a hasty campaign, remains highly uncertain, as 3 major political blocs are competing. The right-wing National Rally, President Emmanuel Macron's centrist alliance, and thirdly, the new Popular Front coalition that includes centre-left, Greens and hard-left forces. The National Rally's lead in the polls and in the first round mean that their leader, Marine Le Pen, has a good shot of being elected as the President of France in 2027. Politico had this to say, quote, "The National Rally's strong performance also opens the possibility that Le Pen, who has campaigned on distancing herself from NATO and the EU and pledged better relations with Russia, could finally make a successful run for president in 2027, sending a shockwave across the Western world." End quote. CNN also reported this today, quote, "As Ukraine bleeds territory to Russia, support from one of Kyiv's strongest backers looks set to falter if the far right sweep into power in Sunday's French parliamentary elections." End quote. Ezekiel 38 implies a situation where Israel's enemies span the territory of Russia and Europe, called Rosh, Magog and Gomer in Ezekiel 38. Similarly, Daniel 2, a parallel prophecy, speaks of the time when the kingdom of men, as Nebuchadnezzar's image, will stand upon its feet in the latter days against Israel. When it does, it will unite the 2 ancient territories of the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, and the Western Roman Empire, today the landmass of the EU. The religious and cultural legacy of the Eastern Roman Empire can today be found in Russia, namely St Petersburg and Moscow. For example, Moscow is sometimes called the Third Rome. We expect to see a closening of ties between Russia and Europe. Whether this is by war or diplomatic means remains unclear. However, it is certainly interesting that there are elements of the EU, as we see in France, that may lean towards Russia. Finally, although the US presidential election is not until November, last week the first debate between President Biden and Donald Trump took place. By all accounts, this was a total disaster for Joe Biden, as his frailty and age was impossible to hide in front of millions of people across the world. The fact that Joe Biden's age was becoming problematic has been something clear for months. However, anyone who talked about this a few weeks ago would have been labelled by the mainstream media as peddling far-right conspiracy theories and being duped by what they called cheap fakes. For example, this was the response taken by many media outlets following Biden's old age wandering around during the D-Day commemorations, or at a fundraiser when Barack Obama had to lead him off the stage as if Biden was in a home for the elderly. The Washington Post said things like, quote, "He was taking in an applauding crowd for a few moments when it looked like he'd frozen and wasn't sure where he was." Another example of this is how CNN flat out lied about Biden's frailty a few weeks ago. Describing an interview Biden had conducted, they said, quote, "In the interview, Biden speaks at length and fluently, easily recalling in-depth details about his vice presidency, family life, and law. He digresses into discussing his power as a eulogist, waxes lyrical about his beloved Delaware, and even seems to be trying to sell the merits of his administration's foreign policy. While it may be a disappointment for Republicans looking for a smoking gun, the transcript will be a goldmine for future historians. The president comes across as helpful, and sometimes like the windy old politician who knows how to filibuster like only a long-time senator can." End quote. This is a joke. This is not news. This is out-and-out propaganda. Just a glance back to news articles over the past months will show the way that the mainstream media has been involved in covering up the aging president and his worsening frailty. With propaganda like that, is it so hard to believe that the left-leaning legacy have also worked to misrepresent conflict in Israel and Gaza in order to promote anti-Semitism? Seeing the way they cover Joe Biden is an eye-opening reminder of how the legacy media work to represent left-wing anti-Semitic talking points when it comes to Israel. They are not a credible source for information, particularly when it comes to the Jewish people. It is not just Christadelphians who are talking about this. The reason for the rise of long-form podcasts and using Twitter or Telegram as news sources stems from a fundamental mistrust in the mainstream media. The unwarranted, favourable coverage of Joe Biden that he has received until the dam broke during the debate when it's no longer possible to hide it is unprecedented. If the mainstream media is so willing to cover up the frailty of the president just to hinder Trump's re-election efforts, who knows what they might say about Israel? They have been major contributors to the spirit of anti-Semitism that we have seen growing in the last year. Join us again next week for another edition of Bible in the News. This has been Daniel Blackburn joining you.